In San Francisco, California, you can tell exactly when you cross into my neighborhood, south of Market. The street grid suddenly shifts, with big, long blocks running diagonal to the rest of the city. In addition to the street grid, south of Market also has a distinct landscape, economy, demographic mix, and history. But the neighborhood has played a central role in the city's identity between San Francisco's founding and today. This video is a historical survey of the full 175 years of South of Market's history. I'm going to talk about the gold rush, the growth and decline of industrial San Francisco, the communities that have come and gone here, and the rise of the modern global tech industry, which is centered here in South of Market. The Spanish established the first European settlement in the area in 1776, a missionary village called Mission Dolores, founded to convert members of the native Remitisha Ohlone tribe to Catholicism. However, the settlement that would become the city of San Francisco wasn't established until 1834 as a secular Mexican settlement. Today, that settlement, which was originally called Yerba Buena, is located north in Chinatown. Yerba Buena was tiny, less than 200 people. However, with the Mexican-American War, discovery of gold in the Sierra Mountains, and declaration of California as the 31st state, the city went through a period of extreme population growth. The first American wave of migrants were 200 Mormons in 1847, but the gold rush, starting in 1849, brought 300,000 people to California. About half of those people arrived by boat and passed through the city on their way to the Sierra Mountains in the east. By this point, the city of Yerba Buena had been renamed San Francisco to reflect the fact that it was the primary city on San Francisco Bay. At the time, San Francisco was the main port on the entire West Coast, and there was no transcontinental railroad and no Panama Canal, so migrants traveling by boat to San Francisco had to take a 16,000-mile boat trip all the way around South America. Because gold rush migration was pretty much exclusively one way, from the East Coast to the West Coast, thousands of boats were abandoned in Yerba Buena Cove because nobody could staff them, many of which were eventually sunk and used as landfill for extending the boundary of the city into San Francisco Bay. Some of these boats have been identified in archaeological digs in the South of Market neighborhood. Additionally, many of the names of these ships, the Annie, the Jessie, the Tehama, and the Clementine, are today names of streets in South of Market. The rate of population growth in San Francisco really was unprecedented for American cities. I can't think of any other American city before or after that grew so quickly from so little. The population increased so fast, there wasn't infrastructure to build enough homes, so 5,000 homes were sent 16,000 miles from the East Coast around Cape Horn to be installed in the city. Between 1849 and 1850, the population of San Francisco increased significantly from 1,000 to 25,000, and it needed to expand its street grid southward. Fortunately, during the American military occupation of Mexican Yerba Buena 2 years earlier in 1847, a military surveyor, Jasper O'Farrell, had planned for future expansions of the existing Yerba Buena street grid. But why does O'Farrell's plan become diagonal south of Market Street? It's because O'Farrell wanted to incorporate an existing diagonal trail from Yerba Buena to Mission Dolores. That trail became Mission Street, and the northern boundary of the new neighborhood became Market Street, which was named after Market Street in Philadelphia. Because of its location at the intersection of the two conflicting street grids, Market Street would eventually become the main downtown avenue of San Francisco, and it would define the northern border and name of this neighborhood, south of Market. The perpendicular streets were numbered starting with 1st Street at the coastline of Yerba Buena Cove. At the time, it was extremely difficult to use the trail on Mission Street to get from San Francisco to Mission Dolores, because the path was in areas extremely swampy or covered in sand dunes. Mission Dolores was popular for the men of San Francisco because it hosted bullfights, duels, and other recreational events. So the Plank Toll Road was built in 1850 to help travelers pass over the difficult terrain without getting their animals and carts stuck in the sand and mud. The first settlers to live in northern South of Market, which at the time was called Happy Valley because it was sunnier than the rest of the city, were gold prospectors, stopping in the city before heading to the Sierras to mine for gold. But by 1853, the gold rush was pretty much over, and the neighborhood started growing its permanent population. By this point, The population of San Francisco had risen to 50,000 people in just 4 years, and almost none of them were women. There were about 1,000 women in San Francisco, or about 2% of the city's population. There was no official count of sex workers in the city, but San Francisco's reputation as a center for prostitution, as well as the small number of babies born in the city, indicate that many of the women in the city were prostitutes. Some people have speculated that streets like Jesse Street, Clementina Street, Minna Street, and Clara Street were named after the most popular prostitutes. But, as I mentioned earlier, it's more likely that those streets were named after the ships the early gold miners came in on, like the Jesse, the Clementine, the Minna, and the Clara. Some of the sand dunes in the neighborhood were over 100 feet tall, so for the city to expand, those dunes needed to be flattened. This occurred mostly over the course of the 1850s. The extracted sand was used to fill in Yerba Buena Cove, Mission Bay, and low-lying parts of the neighborhood. This extended the boundaries of South of Market both eastward and southward. However, the usage of sand as landfill in South of Market means that today the neighborhood is one of the most high-risk neighborhoods in the city for earthquakes, which can liquefy the soil. The Millennium Tower, which is the infamous leaning and cracking tower in San Francisco, was built on landfill just off the coast of Yerba Buena Cove. Furthermore, if you walk around South of Market today, you can see that many of the buildings, particularly older buildings, have either sunk below street level or are leaning away from the building next to them. As the neighborhood grew, discrete sub-neighborhoods emerged. The oldest, poorest, and most polluted neighborhood was in a low-lying area near First Street. A natural gas refinery, the Donahue Gas Works, dumped the byproducts of coal refining directly into open water in the neighborhood. As a result, this area strongly smelled like chemicals and tar, so San Francisco residents gave it the name Tar Flat. Tar Flat was an early-stage industrial neighborhood, with ironworks and other small-scale manufacturing businesses developing alongside pretty tightly packed residential tenements. Directly above Tar Flat, to the south, was one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city, Rincon Hill. Even though it was physically close to Tar Flat, Rincon Hill was over 100 feet above the bay, which meant that the residents of the Rincon Hill mansions were isolated from the smell and the noise of Tar Flat, even though they were physically close. Rincon Hill elites would commute to work across Tar Flat into the financial district north of Market Street. This isolation, plus the views of the city from the top of Rincon Hill, made it the most popular place to live for the early wealthy residents of San Francisco. Just south of Rincon Hill was another luxury neighborhood, South Park. South Park's location was chosen for development because it was the only flat area in South of Market which was free of sand dunes. Unlike Rincon Hill, which was mostly populated by large mansions each surrounded by its own yard, South Park was much more conventionally urban, with townhouses surrounding a small neighborhood park inspired by British garden squares. To the southwest were slaughterhouses, which used the flow of Mission Creek as well as tidal surges to wash away blood and animal remains for meat being processed for consumption in San Francisco. In the 1860s, the southern coast of the neighborhood became home to a major shipbuilding and ship repair industry. The most significant institution in the neighborhood was Pacific Mail Docks at the end of 2nd Street. The Pacific Mail Steamship Company was the largest American company involved in the growing trans-Pacific trade. As a result, many of the Chinese immigrants who came to California and worked on the railroads in the 19th century came via this dock. However, the growing shipbuilding industry in South of Market drew attention to a problem with the geography of the neighborhood. Rincon Hill, the largest hill in South of Market, lay directly between downtown and the docks. Making this corridor easily passable for animals and carriage traffic was important for the economy of the city, so in 1869, San Francisco undertook a major engineering project called the 2nd Street Cut, which flattened 2nd Street through Rincon Hill. As a result of this project, and also the growing presence of both immigrants and heavy industry in the surrounding area, the wealthy residents of Rincon Hill pretty much all left the neighborhood for Nob Hill north of Market Street. This was the end of the residential presence of San Francisco's elite in South of Market. Wealthy San Franciscans didn't return to this neighborhood for over a century, until the rise of the tech industry in the 1990s and early 2000s. The first Japanese immigrants came to San Francisco and settled in an area between 5th Street and 7th Street called Nihonji-machi, or Peopletown in Japanese. I couldn't find any images of Nihonji-machi online, and none of the buildings survived. San Francisco's rate of population growth was pretty unprecedented in American history. By 1870, It had a population of 150,000, making it the 10th largest city in America, despite being only 20 years old. It was the military center, financial capital, and industrial capital on the West Coast, and had a larger population than Los Angeles, Seattle, Portland, Sacramento, Oakland, and San Jose combined. 1 in 5 Americans who lived on the West Coast lived within the city of San Francisco, and the port of San Francisco controlled 99% of all West Coast imports. San Francisco benefited significantly from being the only major American city with a port on the West Coast, meaning it had a monopoly on trade with China, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and other Pacific countries. Additionally, because it was so far from the industrial network of the American East Coast, the city had to develop its own relatively independent manufacturing industry. South of Market was flat, it had large blocks, and it was close to the port, so almost all of the industrial investment in San Francisco was invested here. There was a large surplus of male labor due to the overall gender imbalance of the city. Lots of men had moved to San Francisco during the gold rush and during the settlement of California, and now they needed work. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough demand for labor to meet the supply. There were relatively few families compared to the number of single workers, so the local consumer market just wasn't that big. Additionally, it was costly to ship manufactured goods back to the East Coast. Persistently low employment resulted in a really high amount of socialist activity in the late 19th century in South of Market. The most well-known of the San Francisco socialists was Jack London, the author of Call of the Wild, who was born in South of Market in 1876. Although he left the neighborhood, he wrote extensively about class conflict in the city. He characterized San Francisco as divided between two groups. The first group lived north of the slot, or north of the cable car slot running along Market Street. This group was primarily the financial and business class of San Francisco, occupying small office and residential blocks with almost no manufacturing presence. They were physically uphill from South of Market, isolated from the pollution and runoff generated by the industrial neighborhood. The second group lived south of the slot, which is now South of Market. The second group were the working-class residents of San Francisco. They operated the port, the factories, the laundries, the warehouses, and the other blue-collar institutions of the city. The working-class population of South of Market could generally be split into two discrete groups. The first was highly transient, almost all men, stopping in San Francisco on their way to another part of California, or migratory laborers like loggers, whalers, and longshoremen staying only for a short time in the city between jobs. The transient population lived mostly in boarding houses, which were small, short-term hotels for single men. At boarding houses, they could sleep, get meals, gamble, and look for work. This population of men was spread throughout the American West, and they generally inspired the archetype of the hobo, which was a migratory seasonal laborer in the mid to late 19th century. The second population in the neighborhood was the permanent population, mostly large white families who ran boarding houses or who worked in the factories in the neighborhood. The second population had a large Irish contingent, but also included Northern Europeans of many other different cultural backgrounds. They were much more gender mixed than the transient population, but were still generally pretty poor. San Francisco had grown to over 350,000, and 60,000 people lived in South of Market, making it one of the densest neighborhoods in America. South of Market's top industries were metalworking east of First Street, woodworking and shipbuilding along the southern coast, and shipping along the east coast. The Southern Pacific Railroad built rail connections along the Embarcadero to docks on the east side of the neighborhood, as well as a new passenger terminal in Mission Bay connecting San Francisco to the rest of the San Francisco Peninsula. Tracks were installed throughout the flat neighborhood for horse cars, which were like the later invented streetcars, but instead were pulled by animals. Throughout the 19th century, labor groups in South of Market had gained a large amount of support from the neighborhood's working-class residents. There was the Sailors Union of the Pacific, various longshoremen's associations, building trades unions, the Iron Trades Council, and many other industry-specific labor groups. The labor movement in this time period was highly racialized, specifically anti-Chinese. In 1877, the Workingmen's Party, with the slogan, "The Chinese Must Go," led anti-Chinese riots at City Hall, and throughout the rest of the century, Chinese laborers and Chinese-owned businesses would face physical harassment from white San Francisco labor groups. As a result, there was no Chinese community south of Market. Towards the end of the 19th century, many of these labor unions became coordinated with one another. organizing large multi-union strikes in 1887, 1901, and 1905. This was a high point for the labor movement in the city. Starting in 1901, San Francisco's Union Labor Party would dominate San Francisco politics for over a decade. What's really striking about the South of Market neighborhood and the city more broadly is just how packed in and crowded everything was. In addition to the large industrial facilities, there were a large number of smaller shops, smaller homes, and saloons, almost all made of wood, filling in the rest of the neighborhood. South of Market was a dense patchwork of industry and residential life. Machine shops shared blocks with boarding houses, while foundries and furniture factories operated next to corner saloons. Every available space was filled, if not by a distillery or paint plant, then by a small workshop or wooden home. The only stone structures in the neighborhood were the post office and the U.S. Mint at 5th and Mission Street, built in 1870. San Francisco was absolutely dominant, but its position on the San Andreas Fault and construction on top of mostly sand and landfill made it very vulnerable to earthquakes. Furthermore, its density made it very vulnerable to fire, and in mid-April 1906, San Francisco would suffer the largest urban earthquake in American history, as well as the largest urban fire in American history, all within a span of 3 days.
On this spring morning, most of the city was still asleep. But before the sun would rise, San Francisco's destiny would be changed forever.
Many people say Sodom and Gomorrah. This was Sodom and Gomorrah, and by golly, it met its fate.
San Francisco met its fate on Wednesday, April the 18th at 5:12 a.m. The San Andreas Fault tore apart. So did the city. The first shock lasted 45 violent seconds. Its impact was devastating. The area with the most severe damage was south of Market, near 6th and Howard Streets. It was a densely populated, working-class district of tenements built on landfill, which liquefied. As many as 500 people may have been killed. If San Francisco had an epicenter, this was it.
The buildings down there, which were generally flimsy, they just went to pieces, especially if they had been built on creeks or swamps. They were thrown off of their foundations, or they actually collapsed. They pancaked.
The 7.6 magnitude earthquake broke the city's water pipes, making the fire department unable to stop the multiple fires which quickly spread throughout the city. Almost the entire city was gone. Refugees lived in tents and shacks all over the city, and South Park, which was previously a high-end residential enclave, became a refugee camp. The rubble from the destroyed buildings was used to further expand the boundaries of the city outwards, and San Francisco started rebuilding immediately. There had been a 1905 plan to redesign the city in accordance with the City Beautiful movement, with wide boulevards cutting diagonals across city blocks. However, this plan was never executed, even after the earthquake. The only permanent City Beautiful design which was implemented after the earthquake was that of City Hall and Civic Center. In South of Market, only the stone mint and the stone post office were left standing. The bank vaults in the financial district were still under the rubble of the earthquake, so the mint became the only place residents could get money to finance the rebuilding of the city. If you visit San Francisco today, you'll see that almost the entire eastern half of the city is comprised of buildings built between 1906 and 1930. Why construction stopped in the middle of the 20th century, I'll discuss later. The Japanese community of Nihonjimachi was first relocated to the refugee camp in South Park, then resettled in its current location north of Market Street, now known as Japantown. A Greek neighborhood known as Greektown emerged on 3rd Street after an influx of Greek immigrants who helped rebuild the city settled in the area. There were numerous improvements in South of Market. The horsecar lines were electrified and became electric streetcar lines, and the industrial facilities were enlarged and modernized. In rebuilding, South of Market doubled down on its industrial character. Many of the working-class communities which had lived in the neighborhood used the earthquake as a catalyst to move into the Mission, away from the pollution and noise of South of Market. So many people moved out of the neighborhood in this time period that it took over 100 years to regain its 1906 population. As a result of this migration, the neighborhood gender balance shifted from 70% men back to 90% men. Most of the residential buildings built in the neighborhood were residential hotels or boarding houses for single men and seasonal labor. 63% of homes were classified as low value, which was significantly above the city average of 25%, and the foreign-born population of the neighborhood was roughly two-thirds. Partially because of the high demand for labor to rebuild the city, the decade after the earthquake was a quiet period for the pro-labor movement. The industrial economy of San Francisco, specifically south of Market and along the coast, was booming, driven largely by the food industry. In the early 20th century, the United States began expanding its economic influence over Central American countries, in many cases installing banana republics in the interest of expanding American trade networks. Many of the crops grown in these countries, including literally bananas, were imported into the U.S. by the United Fruit Company terminal in South of Market, where they were unloaded and packaged for sale regionally. Additionally, World War I gave the U.S. the opportunity to take over European trade networks in Central America. Throughout the neighborhood, new facilities sprung up to facilitate the growing food trade, particularly in fruit and coffee. There was the Folgers Coffee Company on Howard Street, Hills Brothers Coffee on the coast, MJB Coffee at 3rd and Townsend, the United Fruit Company Banana Terminal in China Basin, and other facilities around the neighborhood. Additionally, many of the crops grown in California's Central Valley came to market via processing plants at the Port of San Francisco. Each pier at the port was directly connected to a Beltline freight rail system that linked the waterfront to the Southern Pacific Railroad's intermodal freight rail and passenger rail facilities, which was almost an entire square mile, and facilitated the transfer of agricultural and manufactured goods between the inland rail system and the water. This rail system traveled south of Market, directly through the streets of the Mission. This was a boom period for San Francisco and for South of Market in particular. The city's industries recovered quickly, and downtown San Francisco expanded southward. This expansion blurred the lines between North of Market and South of Market. The Pacific Telephone Building, built in 1927 on New Montgomery Street, was the tallest building in the city and signified the growth of commercial uses in South of Market. Despite San Francisco's prosperity after the earthquake, it lost its relative dominance on the West Coast during this time period. Between the 1906 earthquake and 1930, the population of San Francisco increased 50% to 630,000. However, it was the slowest growing large city on the West Coast. The population of Portland doubled to 300,000, the population of Seattle doubled to 360,000, the population of Oakland tripled to 300,000, and the population of Los Angeles quintupled to 1.2 million, making LA by far the largest and most economically important city on the West Coast. San Francisco would never again regain its spot in the top 10 most populous cities in the United States. The Great Depression, starting in 1929, marked the beginning of the end for the manufacturing industry in South of Market. Many of the men in South of Market struggled to find work due to low nationwide demand for goods. Furthermore, new arrivals from Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas who were escaping the Dust Bowl exacerbated the competition for jobs. 3rd Street had historically been a key commercial corridor for South of Market due to its connection to southern portions of the city via the 3rd Street Bridge. However, during the Great Depression, it became associated with the unemployed men who frequented the saloons and gambling halls. It became synonymous with alcoholics and gamblers, and locals started calling it Skid Road. In the first part of the 1930s, tensions progressively grew between labor groups and business owners. In May of 1934, a strike by longshoremen paralyzed the shipping industry along the entire West Coast. In San Francisco, the strike escalated into a violent conflict between strikers and the National Guard, who militarized South of Market from their headquarters in the Armory, located just southwest of the neighborhood. Sandbag encampments for machine gunners were installed on street corners, and tanks patrolled the neighborhood to intimidate protesters. Tear gas was frequently used on strikers, and on July 5th, known as Bloody Thursday, 2 strikers were shot by police. Anger over these deaths triggered a citywide general strike, during which over 100 unions refused to work, effectively shutting down the city. In the end, the longshoremen won many of their demands, including a raise to $1 an hour. The mid-1930s was a transformative period for South of Market infrastructurally as well as socially. The most economically important bridge in San Francisco, the Bay Bridge, was completed in 1936.
As far back as 1856, men dreamed of linking the city of San Francisco with the east shore of the bay. Today, there towers over San Francisco Bay a realization of the century-old dream. A 6-lane double-deck bridge, 8 miles long, connecting San Francisco with the Oakland-Berkeley area, spanning the largest major navigable body of water ever bridged.
Although multiple locations were considered for the Bay Bridge, South of Market was selected as the location for the bridge approach. The remaining portion of Rincon Hill was one of the only parts of South of Market that hadn't been rebuilt after the earthquake, and it was just the right height for the Bay Bridge to land on top of. Numerous blocks of the neighborhood were seized via eminent domain, including the Greek neighborhood, Greektown. After 3 years of construction, the bridge opened to the public in 1936. For the first 3 decades of its operation, the bridge had a top level for vehicles and a bottom level for streetcars, which connected the East Bay to a new terminal station at 1st and Mission Street, the Transbay Terminal, opened in 1939. In some ways, the Bay Bridge symbolized the displacement of industrial San Francisco by a commuter class of workers from the South Bay and East Bay arriving by car. By this point, San Francisco's relative power in the industrial landscape of the West Coast was already declining. Its reputation as a hotbed for labor organizing hurt its ability to attract industrial investment, and numerous other cities with more space, like Los Angeles, Seattle, and San Diego, were all growing quickly. Furthermore, it was logistically easier to ship goods directly across the bay to Oakland rather than unloading in San Francisco and then driving across the bay. With the construction of the Bay Bridge and the rise in popularity of the automobile, the neighborhood became very attractive to white-collar workers who didn't live in the city but wanted to work downtown. Although the port of San Francisco would technically remain operational as an industrial port for the next few decades, it didn't occupy quite the same central role in San Francisco's cultural and political landscape as it did in the first 100 years of the city's history. Today, the Port of San Francisco isn't even in the top 5 ports in California, and it's only number 3 in the Bay Area, significantly behind Oakland by an order of magnitude. Nevertheless, the neighborhood continued to evolve in distinct and arguably even more interesting ways. The 1950s was the first of 3 consecutive decades in which San Francisco's population declined. By 1980, San Francisco had lost 100,000 people. This had never happened before in San Francisco's history. Even in the 1900s, the decade of the earthquake, the city grew by 70,000 people. This 30-year-long demographic shift had huge consequences for the neighborhood. South of Market still had a large population of single men, but many remained unemployed. These men had worked in the factories and port during the neighborhood's industrial heyday decades earlier and were now either in other fields or were retired. Without a large influx of people, the quality of life in South of Market declined significantly. There were more residents living on the street, an increased rate of alcohol abuse, and many of the buildings, which had been built quickly in the immediate aftermath of the 1906 earthquake, were falling apart and sometimes being abandoned. The presence of the highway made the neighborhood noisy, polluted, and less attractive to the growing classes of people working downtown. The neighborhood Skid Row, populated mostly by unemployed and sometimes homeless men, was expanding. South of Market was definitively in decline. But South of Market was not alone. Almost all large American cities had a decline in population between 1950 and 1980 due to suburbanization. It was a scary time to run a dense city like San Francisco. It seemed like Americans had permanently moved away from neighborhoods like South of Market. The San Francisco government was concerned about the residential real estate market suffering from blight, where the negative appeal of a declining neighborhood makes nearby neighborhoods start to decline as well. On the other hand, San Francisco's office real estate market was doing perfectly fine, with commuters from outside the city making up for population losses at the metro center. So, 15 years into the decline in 1966, the city's leaders came up with a plan to replace tax-negative residential properties in a portion of central south of Market with a tax-positive project comprising offices and a stadium to attract suburban consumers. The problem is that the city would have to seize land by eminent domain and kick out the people who lived there, most of whom were longtime renters. San Francisco's labor unions were split on the issue. On the one hand, the redevelopment project was a source of jobs for union members who might not have work due to low rates of housing construction at the time. On the other hand, kicking out renters, many of whom were union members themselves, was pretty obviously not the pro-labor position. Unlike owners, who were compensated for the transfer in ownership, renters were not entitled to compensation when they were forced to switch rental apartments. In 1967, a new group called Tenants and Owners in Opposition to Redevelopment emerged, suing the city for planning to remove tenants without providing reasonably similar housing options. There was a long court case, and the city basically won, but the legacy of redevelopment really cemented the idea of urban change as a bad thing in the minds of San Francisco residents. Although justified in this case, the anti-development sentiment would come to define San Francisco's politics in the next few decades and would later create significant problems for the city in the 2010s and 2020s, but we haven't gotten there yet. Nobody ended up building the offices and arena that were planned for the site, so it sat empty for 10 years, being used as a parking lot for downtown commuters. Eventually, a convention center called the Moscone Center and a park called Yerba Buena Gardens were built, where they remain today. The community that was displaced, of extremely low-income, mostly elderly men, moved to 6th Street, 3 blocks to the west. However, two communities took advantage of population decline in south of Market, the Kink community and the Filipino community. In the mid-20th century, the city was becoming well known as a hub for gay men. San Francisco's gay history goes back to its pioneer days, when the city was very sexually permissive as well as being almost exclusively male. Furthermore, the U.S. Navy in both World War I and World War II had a practice of discharging gay men in ports on the West Coast. As a result of these influences, San Francisco soon became home to 4 distinct gay neighborhoods, the last 2 of which are still prominent. The first was in North Beach, the second extended from Polk Street into the Tenderloin, the third and most famous is the Castro west of the Mission, and the fourth, and in my opinion the most interesting, was south of Market. By 1960, south of Market felt pretty empty due to general industrial decline and the exodus of families in the neighborhood after the earthquake. However, it was still centrally located, it had cheap rent and cheap buildings, and parking was plentiful at night. Most importantly, the empty streets at night gave privacy and safety to men looking to meet other men for sexual encounters. In 1964, Life magazine published the country's first nationwide article on homosexuality, centered on the culture of San Francisco, which it declared the gayest city in America. The article, which featured a bar in south of Market, encouraged many gay American men interested in the leather culture to move to the neighborhood. As Jack Fisher, a gay historian, wrote, "Tourists to San Francisco in one summer were residents by the next. Golden Age sex put many a Midwestern career in law, medicine, teaching, and business on hold. Man-to-man sex was the siren call. Basically, you had a lot of horny young men finally unrestrained and turning loose. Reportedly, the practice of fisting was invented in south of Market around this time." The bar featured in the article, the Toolbox at 4th and Harrison, was similar to other gay bars in the neighborhood in that its name alluded to gay sex and masculine iconography. Examples of other bar names included the Slot, the Ambush, the Ramrod, the Stud, the Arena, the Trench, the Cave, the Barracks, the Red Star Saloon, the No Name, the Bolt, Powerhouse, the Black and Blue, Headquarters, the Stables, Chaps, and the Eagle, which still exists today. The leather culture is a gay subculture that emphasizes masculinity in part as a rejection of stereotypes of gay men as effeminate. Elements of leather culture include an emphasis on masculine aesthetics and culture, like motorcycles, work clothes, military uniforms, and police uniforms. The abandoned industrial nature of south of Market lent itself to this set of aesthetics, so it's no surprise that of all neighborhoods in San Francisco, this is the one where that culture emerged. By 1971, the New York Times had declared San Francisco the porn capital of America, and south of Market was the gay porn capital of America. Erotic magazines like Vector and the Falcon File spread the south of Market aesthetic to gay subscribers across the country, as well as a generally anti-assimilationist political and cultural message. Unlike the Castro, which was a residential neighborhood, South of Market was still primarily industrial and commercial. As a result, the gay presence in the neighborhood was driven by patrons of clubs, bathhouses, and sex clubs rather than their residential tenants. These institutions, particularly the bathhouses and sex clubs, became especially controversial during the AIDS pandemic in the 80s, and in 1984, the San Francisco city government forced the bathhouses to close. As a result, although some of the gay bars are still around, San Francisco has no gay bathhouses. By 1990, the gay male population in San Francisco had reached almost 50,000, concentrated mostly in and around the Castro. Almost 20,000 men died of AIDS-related complications in San Francisco, which was a huge portion of the gay male population. Fear over the AIDS pandemic significantly decreased the number of gay men moving to San Francisco, but by then the community was already well established. Gay women tended to live across the bay in Oakland. The cheap rent and central location of South of Market contributed to the rise of another community in the neighborhood, the Filipino diaspora. San Francisco had had a Filipino-American community since the Spanish-American War and annexation of the Philippines by the United States through the first half of the 20th century. However, two events in 1965 completely transformed the Filipino presence in the U.S. First, the beginning of the Ferdinand Marcos dictatorship in 1965 forced many Filipinos to flee the country over the next few decades. Second, the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act removed the national maximum of only 100 Filipino immigrants allowed into the country per year. By 1970, 20,000 Filipino immigrants were arriving per year, and the Philippines became the second highest source of immigrants after only Mexico. By 1980, the congregation of St. Joseph's Church on Howard Street became the largest Filipino congregation in America as more and more Filipinos moved into the neighborhood. Despite the highly religious nature of the Filipino population and their close proximity to the gay community, I wasn't able to find any historical details about conflict between the two groups. By 1990, South of Market had become the main Filipino cultural hub in Northern California, with roughly 15,000 Filipinos living in South of Market, or 30% of the neighborhood's population. The cheap rent of South of Market in the 60s, 70s, and 80s made it attractive to artists. One of these artists was the photographer Delaney, who documented the neighborhood in the 1980s, including the leather community, the architectural tension between the neighborhood's shrinking industrial base and a growing downtown, the social tension between low-income renters and redevelopment projects, and the cultural diversity of the neighborhood. By the end of the 1980s, South of Market was on the verge of another major transformation. The center of the American tech industry has historically been the Santa Clara Valley, also called Silicon Valley, roughly 30 miles to the south of San Francisco. The reason for this is that Stanford University and the institutions surrounding it created a critical mass of engineers and entrepreneurs who created companies like Hewlett-Packard, Sun Microsystems, Fairchild Semiconductor, Intel, and Google. This attracted companies that wanted to take advantage of the talent network, like Apple, Adobe, eBay, and NVIDIA. As usage of the internet grew throughout the 1990s, the tech industry expanded beyond the physical bounds of the Santa Clara Valley. Although San Francisco is 30 miles to the north, a collection of multimedia startups began taking advantage of the abundance of warehouse space in the city, specifically in South of Market. South of Market in particular was attractive because it had low rent, it was close to downtown, close to the Caltrain station, and close to the highway, which could take you directly into the Santa Clara Valley. Moreover, the presence of artists and alternative communities in the neighborhood was appealing to creatively minded employees of multimedia companies like video game companies, graphics companies, and websites. The suburban nature of Silicon Valley, by contrast, wasn't as appealing to new graduates as was urban San Francisco. As the employee bases of these tech companies started growing, rent in the neighborhood exploded. Evictions, which are often correlated with high prices, also increased during this period. Although the dot-com bubble burst in 2000, the tech industry had already planted its flag in San Francisco, and as the industry recovered, the stress on the city's rental market would put pressure on low-income and middle-income San Franciscans, many of whom would leave it in the next 2 decades. Throughout the late 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, San Francisco became famous as the startup capital of the world. Companies like Craigslist, Salesforce, Yelp, Twitter, Dropbox, Reddit, Instagram, Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, Square, Flickr, Slack, Instacart, Coinbase, DoorDash, and Stripe either started in San Francisco or relocated to San Francisco. Companies like Google, Microsoft, LinkedIn, and Meta all have satellite offices in the city as well. South of Market has by far the largest concentration of these companies of any neighborhood in San Francisco. And much of this industry occupies space which is still legible as being built for other historical uses. South Park, which at times had been a luxury development, an industrial neighborhood, a refugee camp, and a Japanese enclave, became a center for venture capital, which is the portion of the financial industry that drives investment in early-stage startups. Twitter was conceptualized in a small headquarters in South Park before upgrading to an old jewelry warehouse on Bryant Street in 2008, then upgrading again to its most recent location in an old furniture warehouse on Market Street in 2011, before being moved to Texas by Elon Musk in 2024. The old banana terminal of the United Fruit Company, which processed fruits coming from Central America, has been converted into the headquarters of Lyft. An old battery factory built in 1917 on Brennan Street is now the headquarters of Airbnb. The Hills Brothers Coffee Company warehouse on the waterfront is the tech-oriented West Coast campus for the University of Pennsylvania Business School. In 1960, South of Market had been a symbol of the struggles of urban neighborhoods in the mid-20th century, which city leaders considered to be more valuable as parking than as a neighborhood. By 2010, however, the neighborhood was the most economically important place in San Francisco and arguably on the entire West Coast. In most respects, the emergence of South of Market as a new center for the tech industry was due to intrinsic attributes of the neighborhood and its location near both downtown and the Santa Clara Valley. However, city leadership also played an active role in making the neighborhood more appealing to young, white-collar professionals. For example, the industrial waterfront was remade into a park for tourists and residents, with public art and green space, connecting the Ferry Building with a new baseball stadium for the San Francisco Giants, completed in 2000. A new subway line was planned, connecting the new stadium and the Caltrain station to downtown. The old Transbay bus terminal, which had historically connected San Francisco to Oakland via a light rail line, was renovated into a new transit center, including a new high-speed rail station underground and a linear park on the ridge. New offices, including Salesforce Tower, were built in the surrounding area to help finance the construction of the project. Today, Caltrain's terminal station is about a mile south of the Transbay Center, at the historic location of the Southern Pacific Railroad's intermodal freight transfer facilities. However, a new tunnel will soon connect the existing tracks to the Transbay Center. Commuters from the San Francisco Peninsula will be able to travel directly into downtown via Caltrain, and travelers from Southern California will be able to also travel directly into downtown via the same tracks on California High-Speed Rail. The existing Caltrain station and its yards will be moved underground, and the lot will be redeveloped into a pretty large mixed-use development with both housing and office space. As was the case in many American cities, the COVID pandemic in 2020 led to a large exodus of San Francisco residents. Although it's true that both home prices and rents decreased during the pandemic, they remain high, roughly 3 times what they were before the start of the tech boom. Since the pandemic, rents have continued to rise, as San Francisco remains a desirable place to live. The rise of the tech industry has driven a cultural and social wedge between longtime residents and tech workers, many of whom are transplants with high incomes and were blamed for the exodus of artists and middle-class San Franciscans caused by high rent. Enmity probably peaked in the mid-2010s, during which there were sporadic protests against tech companies and their employees. New construction, by association with the tech industry and with the failed redevelopment projects of the 1970s, was seen by many longtime residents, both tenants and owners, as a driver of gentrification. As a result of political pressures and the general skepticism in San Francisco against redevelopment, as I discussed earlier, the city approved almost no new homes outside of South of Market during this 30-year period. Today, most neighborhoods in San Francisco look pretty much exactly the same as they did in 1930, at the end of the most recent large wave of new home construction in the city. Even in south of Market, the only neighborhood with a notable amount of home construction in the last 30 years, there are many blocks that look almost exactly the same as they did 100 years ago. As a result of city policies that make building apartment buildings either illegal or extremely difficult in most neighborhoods, the city's population has grown by only 10% over the last 30 years, making it the slowest growing period in the city's history outside of the period of population decline between 1950 and 1980. Today, south of Market's population is roughly 60,000, pretty much exactly as populous as it was in 1906, just before the 1906 earthquake. Throughout the neighborhood, you'll find lots of things that you'd usually only expect in places with much lower land values, like self-storage, auto body shops, empty parking lots, and vacant commercial space. This makes for a pretty stark contrast between some of the most valuable office and housing in the world in pretty close proximity to property that's remained undeveloped for decades. As a result of land use policies that strongly discourage the construction of new homes, the south of Market population is distributed highly unevenly, with high population blocks usually dominated by a single new apartment building and low population blocks usually comprised of relatively low utility commercial space. By contrast, when you look at the population distribution map of the city as a whole, you can see that in most neighborhoods, population is pretty evenly distributed block by block, with major exceptions in city parks mostly on the west side, downtown, which is mostly office buildings, and Ilai Creek in the southeast, which is still pretty industrial. South of Market, which deindustrialized a long time ago, doesn't really have a good reason for having so many blocks with such low population. It's not like there's particularly high demand for auto body shops, empty parking lots, and storage facilities. Personally, I think the last 30 years have been a major missed opportunity for the city to help control the rise in rent by legalizing more apartments near downtown and near the Caltrain station. As a direct result of the rise in residential rent, the Filipino community in south of Market shrunk to 5,000 people in 2010 and 2,500 by 2020. Furthermore, the COVID shutdown killed many of the legacy Filipino businesses in the neighborhood, including the Filipino language bookstore and many of the Filipino restaurants. Today, Daly City, 7 miles to the southwest, has overtaken south of Market as the center of Filipino cultural life in the Bay Area. Daly City has a higher absolute number of Filipino residents, over 30,000, and a higher relative number of Filipino residents, roughly a third of the city. If you visit south of Market today, you won't notice a strong Filipino cultural presence. There are very few Filipino restaurants, there's no Filipino architecture, and there are relatively few Filipino people, at 7% of the neighborhood's population compared to 30% in 1990. In response to the declining Filipino presence in south of Market, the city declared the neighborhood a Filipino Cultural Heritage District in 2016 to try to prop up Filipino cultural influence. Since then, the city has funded a project to plaster utility boxes throughout the neighborhood with posters translating English words into Tagalog, the language of the Philippines. Multiple streets and parks were renamed in honor of influential Filipinos, and city-funded murals around the neighborhood depict Filipino people and cultural symbols. Today, there's a strange dynamic where south of Market is comprised almost entirely of non-Filipinos, but the city is trying to project the neighborhood as the Filipino district. As I mentioned before, that role is currently being filled by Daly City, which is significantly more affordable than south of Market. The kink community was less affected by gentrification. Kink culture no longer dominates portions of the neighborhood as it once did, but because the community is comprised mostly of non-residential institutions like bars, clubs, and sex shops, south of Market is still well known for its kink presence. There are bars like the Eagle, over which flies the gigantic kink flag, sex shops like Mr. S, which hosts monthly kink-related events for the community in south of Market, and the most famous example of the kink presence in south of Market, which is the Folsom Street Fair. Every year, the Folsom Street Fair closes off 5 blocks of Folsom Street for a giant outdoor kink festival where people can freely express their fetishes in public. The fair attracts mostly gay men, but not exclusively gay men. There are people who are into public nudity, people who are into wearing furry costumes, people who enjoy getting whipped in public, and various other fetishes that are put on display once a year at the street fair. The pornography industry, specifically the gay porn industry, still has a presence in south of Market. However, strict California health and safety regulations for porn studios enacted in the early 2000s have made it more difficult to film porn in San Francisco as opposed to cities outside the state, like Las Vegas, which has emerged as a new pornography capital. Day to day, the presence of the gay community in South of Market can most easily be seen in flyers attached to light posts along Folsom Street, which usually advertise various clubbing and sex-related events around the neighborhood. Like for the Filipino community, in 2018, San Francisco designated a portion of SoMa to be a cultural district for the leather and LGBTQ community. The cultural district is publicly funded and it hosts public events and funds public art around the neighborhood.
You can keep the lighter, man.
Thanks.
What's your name, man?
Tony.
Tony?
Yeah.
How old are you, like 35, 40?
35.
You look all right. Do you use drugs?
I do fentanyl.
Come
Thanks
on.
for asking.
Which one?
Fentanyl.
What, did you always use fentanyl? Do you use heroin before?
Oh, heroin is my best fucking thing. Oh, you got some?
I don't have any
I
now.
said, I don't care.
I'll give you a couple bucks, though, so you
Oh,
can...
thanks.
Yeah, so when did you switch over from heroin to fentanyl?
I switched. I did heroin for, a long time. And then I switched to meth and then goofballs and then I started speaking British sometimes.
Oh, my goodness.
And then after I was British, I was German.
Oh, man. So then fentanyl. Now you're on fentanyl.
Yeah.
When was the last time you smoked? Today?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, a few
I
minutes
had
ago?
to.
Oh, you had to. All right, tell me your name one more time.
Steve.
Steven? All right, man. Have a good day. Have a good night. Stay safe here at Bard, okay?
When talking about the history, culture, and economy of South of Market, the topic of homelessness is pretty much impossible to ignore. Homelessness in various forms has played a major role in South of Market's social fabric and reputation for pretty much its entire history, but especially today. The bounds of what exactly constitutes homelessness is difficult to pin down, but when you look at the tent cities of the gold rush, the hobos and seasonal laborers of the late 19th century, the winos on blighted post-industrial urban blocks on 3rd Street before the construction of the Yerba Buena Center, and the meth, heroin, and fentanyl addicts of modern San Francisco, you can see a pretty clear historical through line linking these different generations of people. There is no period in South of Market's history when bums, drifters, and vagabonds were not a major part of the neighborhood. Many people disagree on the exact reasons for the attraction of people who are homeless to South of Market, but I'm going to list some of the most reasonable, commonly given ones. First, coastal California's warm climate makes it relatively safe to camp outside year-round, even at night. Second, California has a significant shortage of shelter beds relative to its homeless population. There are two perspectives on this. On one hand, California has 12% of the country's population, but 15% of the homeless beds and 22% of the permanent supportive housing for homeless people. When you look at it this way, California seems to be doing slightly more than its fair share for providing shelter to homeless people in America, and the shortage of beds doesn't seem to be caused by California doing less than other states, but rather by so many of the country's homeless people coming to California, which is not necessarily California's fault. On the other hand, California is responsible for inventing, spreading, and maintaining the most important legal mechanisms that contribute to high home prices, policies like single-family zoning, which has spread across the country since being invented in Berkeley in 1916. So it's hard to confidently judge whether California's actions to stop homelessness are proportional, and it depends on what you believe politically. Third, generally progressive city residents of San Francisco have historically had a very high tolerance for both people camping outside and public drug usage, starting with the Summer of Love in 1967. The extent to which the government should fight drug dealing and drug usage, specifically as it relates to racial issues, has been a major political issue in the U.S. over the past few decades, and San Francisco is definitely on the more permissive, progressive side of the spectrum. Fourth, the federal government ruled in 2018 that cities without enough shelter beds could not arrest people for camping in public, as that would constitute a cruel and unusual punishment. However, this ruling was overturned in 2024 and may change the state of homelessness on the West Coast. Fifth, South of Market and the Mission are the only two substantially flat neighborhoods in the city, making it very easy to get around by foot. Like everybody else, people who are homeless generally don't want to walk uphill if they don't have to, so they stick mostly to the Tenderloin, South of Market, and the Mission, which are the lowest lying neighborhoods in the city. 6. South of Market has historically had a lot of empty space around the highways and around underused industrial space, making it pretty easy to find a relatively quiet place to pitch a tent away from the residential neighborhoods. Seventh, and most relevant to this video, South of Market and the Tenderloin are the center of the city's nonprofit homelessness services. 6th Street, for example, is comprised pretty much entirely of residential hotels from the early 20th century that have been converted into social services and temporary housing for people on the street. What 100 years ago were market-rate, affordable residential hotels have been transferred in ownership to a series of private nonprofits that run them essentially as homeless shelters. One key idea that has shaped South of Market over the last few decades is the idea of harm reduction. Harm reduction is the idea that instead of trying to eliminate drug usage, the government should instead try to eliminate the negative consequences of drug usage, for example, by giving drug users safe supplies, shelter, and non-judgmental counseling, and by training community members to administer Naxalone to save the lives of people overdosing on opioids. Supporters of harm reduction claim that it's an evidence-based approach that's successful in improving the health of homeless people doing injected drugs. But critics of harm reduction say that it can result in an increase in crime and it normalizes drug use, making the negative consequences of drug use more difficult to fight. Personally, as somebody living on an alley off of 6th Street, it's very obvious that things aren't working out. The rise in popularity of fentanyl over the past decade has made drug addiction significantly more dangerous due to just how cheap and addictive fentanyl is compared to other historically popular drugs like heroin, crack, and meth. San Francisco, in particular, has a large population of Honduran migrants, some of whom were trafficked across the southern border. Roughly 50% of the fentanyl dealers in San Francisco are from Honduras, and they often refer to themselves as Hondos. The intersection of 6th Street and Mission Street has been a popular spot to sell directly to homeless people living at the SROs.
Fentanyl, killing everybody.
Here we are on 6th Street, another OD. Very sorry to see this.
For people overdosing on fentanyl, it has the effect of making them lose consciousness and control of their muscles, so that they fold over at the waist. Mostly on Market Street and on 6th Street, you'll see people in this position, swaying back and forth. For people who spend enough time folded over like that, it can permanently affect your posture. Since 2020, over 2,000 people in San Francisco have died of fentanyl overdoses. Because hard drugs are so freely available, it's difficult for people trying to be sober to avoid relapsing. Additionally, it's extremely unsafe to be on the street because people will steal food, drugs, and clothes from each other. I recently spoke with a homeless woman in my neighborhood whose dog was stolen from her and then returned, and she gave me her perspective on life in South of Market.
I have this little outfit, and that's the other thing. So I'm having a hard time surviving out here because
Yeah.
I don't steal, like, at all. I don't do it. Just not. I was raised a thief is a thief is a thief, and they all have this whole, oh, it's from the store, so it's not bad.
Yeah.
Bullshit. If you're stealing from the store, you're stealing from anybody. You're a thief is a thief is a thief. My mom always told me.
Yeah.
And that, you know, it bugs me. So I'm having a hard time surviving because that's what everyone does out here, you know. And honestly, I would sell little drugs back home to support my own habit, but that was, you know. And here, everyone's a drug dealer, and like, it's not. It's just, I don't know. It's weird here. But as far as it's hard to survive on the streets here. It's sad because, like, I don't drink drugs anymore. Like, I don't. I'm saying this, and it's making me sad, but like, the compassion, you know, is like hard to have. And everyone out here is, it's different here, like I said, than anywhere. I've been a few places. People here are just rude, and it's sad because everyone is in a place, and it happens to everyone out here. You know, you get to a place where it's, I'm going to get you before you get me.
Yeah, and stealing from each other and
Right,
stuff, you
they're
think?
just abusing each other in every way. It's awful. And so there's no trust in anyone here. None. It's all. It's horrible.
Is it different for women than it is for men?
Oh, most definitely. It's a man's world either way, and it
Yeah.
is. It is. And you know,
She told me about how, because there's a shortage of rooms in the SROs, which are the old residential hotels being used as supportive housing, men will often coerce women into having sex with them in exchange for shelter indoors. Additionally, because so many people who commit sexual offenses in general eventually end up homeless, both the Tenderloin and 6th Street have an extremely high concentration of registered sex offenders, many of which are registered at the addresses of these SROs. Because of the high population of homeless people suffering from a combination of mental health issues, drug addiction, and the mostly nonviolent crime associated with the drug industry, the quality of life and the quality of public services It's much lower than you'd expect, given the extreme level of economic prosperity in the neighborhood specifically over the past 30 years. For example, throughout the neighborhood you'll find really depressing drug-induced graffitied messages written by homeless people, posters put up by people looking for lost friends and family living on the street, piles of trash and drug paraphernalia left by people using on the sidewalk, and tents often blocking entire sidewalks. It's difficult to plant street trees because inevitably people will rip them out. As a result, for example, 6th Street is full of empty tree wells that are often used as toilets. Most of the public spaces that aren't policed, like the steps in front of the old Mint building, are often taken over by people dealing and doing drugs. The courtyard of the Nancy Pelosi Federal Building used to be open to the public, but the federal government had to install a giant fence around it because of the high concentration of criminal activity going on there. A similar phenomenon can be seen in the city's playgrounds, which are often occupied by adults doing and dealing drugs. Most parts of South of Market don't look like 6th Street, and most of San Francisco definitely doesn't look like South of Market. But what's happening here, in particular what makes national news, is defining many Americans' perception of San Francisco and of progressive cities more broadly. South of Market is one of the only neighborhoods in the city where hotels are allowed to be constructed, so the street conditions here are often the first thing tourists see when they arrive. The worst of it, and most of what I've shown over the last 10 minutes, is within this region. When you're looking at the population distribution of South of Market, there are really two distinct population clusters, divided by the Moscone Center and Yerba Buena Gardens. The first part is between 4th Street and 11th Street north of the highway. This is the most diverse part of South of Market, and arguably in the entire city. It's defined mostly by buildings from the early 20th century, including the SROs of 6th Street, but also includes some large newer developments sprinkled mostly along Market Street. Developments of this scale are extremely rare in San Francisco, but were approved here in part because the city wanted to improve street conditions. This part of South of Market also includes SoMa Filipinas in the Leather Cultural District. The second part is the newest part of the neighborhood. Between 2000 and 2020, the population increased from 1,500 to almost 10,000, making it the highest growth neighborhood in San Francisco. Because new market rate buildings tend to be expensive, the neighborhood has one of the highest average incomes in the city. Remember from the first part of the video that this neighborhood contains Rincon Hill, the location of San Francisco's first luxury neighborhood for the early industrial millionaires. Today, we're finally seeing history repeat itself after over a century of industrialization and then deindustrialization. Eastern South of Market has exactly what you'd expect around new condo buildings, pickleball courts, expensive grocery stores, and tea shops. However, there are still hints of South of Market's pre-tech history, like the E.M. O'Donnell Copper Works on Folsom Street and Clocker's Blacksmith Shop, which is reminiscent of the neighborhood's small-scale metalworking industry that thrived after the 1906 earthquake. The 1865 Oriental Warehouse, which stored goods imported by the Pacific Steamship Company, is now a set of loft condos. South Park, the neighborhood where Instagram and Twitter were both founded, is still a center for the venture capital industry, and walking around South Park, you can still find new tech startups testing and demonstrating their technology, like this humanoid robot crossing in front of a South Park building, which you might recognize as the Hotel Bo Chow at the center of the city's Japanese community in South Park after the earthquake in the early 20th century. Given the persistently significant homelessness issues in South of Market and the rise of work from home during and after the COVID pandemic, there's been some speculation that the tech industry is leaving San Francisco, and South of Market in particular. Although it's true that downtown San Francisco's economic recovery from the pandemic has been slow, and a small number of companies like Twitter or X have left the city, South of Market remains a popular place for tech companies. The neighborhood has just gained a new subway line, and it's about to gain a high-speed rail connection to Los Angeles. Additionally, the current biggest wave in the tech industry is artificial intelligence, and of the most important companies in the industry, multiple are based around South of Market. Anthropic, which operates Claude, is headquartered right next to the Transbay Terminal on Howard Street. OpenAI, which operates ChatGPT, runs out of offices in the Mission and on 3rd Street, both of which are only half a mile south of South of Market. Scale AI, which provides back-end services for the training of AI models, has offices on 5th Street and at the southern tip of the neighborhood. And Databricks, which does AI infrastructure, is also right by the Transbay Center. Many of the remaining leaders in AI, like Google, which runs Gemini, and Meta, which runs Llama, are headquartered in Silicon Valley, but their AI operations are distributed around the world. NVIDIA, which builds specialized chips for AI models, is also in Silicon Valley. There is no other city in the world that competes with San Francisco with respect to artificial intelligence talent, and it's unlikely that the center of the tech industry will leave anytime soon. The presence of the tech industry in South of Market is very, very obvious. All over the neighborhood are billboards advertising back-end infrastructural tools and AI tools. The biggest venture capital firms have offices here, and most strikingly, the streets are full of self-driving cars which navigate completely autonomously without a human driver. Anybody in San Francisco can ride in a self-driving car, just like they would an Uber or a Lyft. One unique aspect of South of Market's demographic history is its unusual tendency to skew significantly male. With the exception of the slightly female-heavy Filipino community that dominated the neighborhood between 1970 and 1990, almost every major demographic group in South of Market leans male. This was true of the gold rush miners of the 1850s, the seasonal laborers of the late 19th century, the post-industrial blue-collar tenants of residential hotels in the mid-20th century, the gay men who moved in mostly between the 60s and the 80s, and now both the homeless men living at the SROs and the migrant drug dealers on 6th Street, as well as the young engineers and tech entrepreneurs mostly in the eastern half of the neighborhood. As a result of all these factors, the ratio of men to women is about 130%, or about 4 men for every 3 women. To put this into perspective, San Jose, which is known for having a surplus of men and thus is sometimes called Man Jose, has a gender ratio of only 103%, which is significantly smaller than South of Market's 130%. What's interesting is that the men who have defined this neighborhood came for completely different reasons, including dreams of striking gold, building companies, finding sex and love, and simply looking for shelter when those dreams collapse. Yet they've all independently contributed to a significant gender imbalance that's persisted for 170 years. The persistent male majority is South of Market's most enduring feature, outlasting multiple earthquakes, redevelopment projects, gentrification, 2 pandemics, and countless boom and bust economic cycles. There's a saying that what happens in San Francisco happens in the rest of America a decade later. This was true of the Summer of Love in 1967, the environmental movement, the gay rights movement, the tech industry, and the housing crisis. If this is still true, South of Market isn't just a neighborhood of interest for this particular video, it's a crystal ball for the rest of the country. How this small pocket of San Francisco navigates its own extreme contradictions may well foreshadow how the rest of urban America will have to confront its own versions of these challenges in years to come. Will we solve homelessness? How will self-driving cars transform our cities? It's hard to say, but you might be able to find the people working on the answers to those questions in South of Market.